Hello Warhammer YouTubers, it's Hooves of Doom back with another topic of the week video. So check down the link below for Vince's original video. If you go there, I'm sure there's plenty of other great responses. So the topic of the week is Warhammer Total War. What are my thoughts on this game? Now, last video I was talking about the golden age of wargaming, and it really is. And it really is, in some ways, the golden age of Warhammer video games as well. I mean, there's been a lot of new games, a lot of up-and-coming games. You have Battlefield Gothic Armada, Vermintide, Armageddon, Warhammer Total War, clearly. Many of upcoming releases as well. There's an Inquisitor game coming out, a Space Hulk game coming out, Dawn of War 3, etc., etc. There's a lot of really interesting games. I've been playing Warhammer games right from the mid 90s. I love these games, and the good thing is that these newer games, certainly the games that have been produced maybe in the last 10 years and more so, are probably ever since Dawn of War in many respects, are more distinctly Warhammer video games. They're specifically produced as opposed to just applying like a Warhammer skin on top of an existing game. So I think that's really interesting. I've actually really wanted to do a video series on Warhammer video games at some point. Perhaps I'll get around to doing that. So when you come to Total War, I have a very long series or history with the Total War series. So I started off playing the Shogun, the very first one, and then Medieval, and then Rome, and then Medieval 2, and Rome 2, and Empire, and then Rome 2, and Shogun 2, and then the current Warhammer Total War. So I played, with the exception, ironically, of the one that applies the most appropriately to my hobby. I've played them all, and I've played them all quite a bit. Shogun 2 I never really got much into, which is a little bit strange because I think that was a pretty popular one. But I love Rome and Medieval and all those. They're really, really good games. Put a lot of hours into them, put a lot into Empire as well. I probably played Empire the most. Medieval 2 might be a pretty, maybe more hours now. Anyways, a lot of hours. I really love the format of building the empires and playing, like building that massive empire and going through all the battles and gaining the resources and just the micromanagement part of it. I absolutely love. It is in many respects, for me, the perfect example of a video game that specifically appeals to like what I want. I love that concept of building the units and building the structures and moving out and slowly expanding, but you play every single battle. I really love it. So I have not played Warhammer Total War. I assume I would really love it. I have been watching the production of the game over the last few years, but it is something that I'm very interested in. We've been thinking about buying maybe some new computers, in part largely because of these upcoming games. Wife and I might get back into World of Warcraft too. I don't know. We'll see. But here's the thing. I had a computer a couple years ago, and it was a good computer. And I gave it away to my brother. And as I have almost every computer I've had in recent memory. And I had a Wii U, which I was playing just last fall, and I sold that. And the reason why I've done that, and in most cases, is to put more time into hobbying. I love playing the games. It was nothing about that. I wasn't getting bored or anything like that. It's more, as much as I enjoy it, I recognize you don't really gain too much from it. There's no finished product. There's nothing that years later you can necessarily be proud about. And I have literally thousands of models that are in need of paint and time and energy. And if I something like World of Warcraft, probably easily like a year of game time. Most, Empire Total War, I think I was around 900 hours. Medieval, like I said, is probably a little bit more. These games are like an abyss in many respects, and video games kind of can be. It's really easy to just, the minute you're off work or off school, to just sit in front of a game and just play it. And I know Warhammer Total War would be like that, right? I know I'm going to play it, play a lot of hours. And so as much as I want to play it, I'm also hesitant about it, because I knew if I devoted that amount of hours to actually painting and hobbying, most of these models would be finished, but they're not. So that's the reason why I've been trying to push that back. I still play like games on my iPad and stuff like that, and it's really easy as a distraction. Sometimes I'll sit down to paint. I'm like, I'll just muck around on my iPad. Get painting, idiot. That was to me, not to you guys. Anyways, so that's why I'm in one point happy and eager to do it, and one point kind of hesitant to actually make that investment, because I know I would love it, and because I love Total War and I know Warhammer, it really is like this perfect unison of both my loves. What do I think about the game being set in the old world? I don't think it's necessarily a big problem. I love the old world. I think Games Workshop will come back to the old world in some respects at some point. I think it could be like the Horus Heresy of AOS, as the Horus Heresy is to 40k. It might be kind of a long-term thing, but I think that they will always have that IP. It will always be there. They can certainly use it, and for games like this. I don't think they could have used AOS simply because the game's in production for so long. I'm not sure if Creative Assembly necessarily knew about the launch of Age of Sigmar. I'm sure they must have been given some sort of advance notice. But the simple fact is that the announcement for the Warhammer Total War came at a point when AOS wasn't even on anyone's mind, because it didn't exist or hadn't been launched at that point. So they couldn't necessarily talk about the development and make a game in a context that wouldn't make any sense. I also think because the old world's more based upon historical examples, you have like the Human Empire, and the way that it works, it's kind of like half in Germany. You got the Bretonnians from medieval Europe. The Empire itself is kind of like the Renaissance type feel. That works. Plus, you have very set maps, a very set kind of context. The world's very defined. Age of Sigmar is not. So I'm not really sure even if it would even work in Age of Sigmar. The idea of building an empire and expanding is not really something that works in AOS, because you can warp all around through realm gates, and no one really cares about like the average dude that's upgrading armor at like your main town. That's just not even a concept that really exists in Age of Sigmar. So the old world is really the perfect platform for it. I do think that they are going to make some expansions. I believe that's the case. I haven't really checked to verify, but I think I have heard that they are doing that, and I think it's like 1 in 3, or something like a number of other games coming out for it, which is good, because I hope they really expand. They add all the other different races, because that's the one critique I've heard a little bit about it. When you look at like Total War Empire, you have they're all just humans, and they all have similar type of units, but you have like 50 or 60 different factions at the beginning. And then by the end of the game, you have like 4 or 5 big ones that are all competing, to who's going to be the world power at that point. Age of Sigmar or Warhammer Total War, begins with like 4 or 5 different factions. So it's a little bit more limited, even though the armies are distinctly different. But I do hope that Age of Sigmar does get some love at some point, and we'll see what they have for that. So will Warhammer Total War be good for the war gaming, and specifically, I guess, the Warhammer community? That's a hard one to really say. I'm sure some people will buy, maybe their mothers or something for Christmas, a one-off model. They're going to maybe build it. Maybe they're going to realize, maybe they might put a couple coats of paint and then realize how difficult it is to actually paint models. But I think it's the type of thing, like for most video games, you do buy like a action figure type thing, and it's just something you put on a bookshelf or whatnot, and it just kind of looks cool, right? There's things like that for World of Warcraft and such, and I think that where that is coming from might be what some gamers are going to do. They're going to buy like a one-off model because Games Workshop, right, is promoting it. You've played the game, now buy the models or something. I don't think that's going to draw in an enormous amount of people. But it doesn't take much to actually make that type of link on the website. And if you go to the Creative Assembly website, for instance, there's links to Games Workshop on there with big advertisements. So I'm sure that will draw some degree of sales, but it's not going to be massive. How much of an actual leap will there be from people that play the game and then say, I'm going to check out wargaming and actually get involved in this very broad, highly specialized hobby? That is probably a very small number, because gaming, you can actually get into all the different specifics, and you can actually be a very pro kind of a video gamer. Applying to those skills necessarily to this hobby where it requires a lot of detail work, a lot of patience. I spend probably a couple hours per model painting. It's a much slower kind of process. It's much more expensive in the long run, and so on and so forth. So they're not necessarily compatible. However, a lot of people simply don't know about wargaming whatsoever. So these types of games can draw some people or make people more aware of the hobby, which is a good thing. And I think even if you take a very small approach and say, well, maybe 1 in 1,000 gamers actually says, I'll check this out. I think that's probably a fairly conservative number, maybe. So 1 in 1,000. That's still, keep in mind this game sold 500,000 copies in the first couple days. And over the long term of it, you're probably looking at, 8 or 9 million maybe, or something, right? Players. So even if you have a very small, significant component that switch over and says, this looks kind of cool, I'm going to pick up one of the start collecting boxes. That could be, in the long run, actually a fairly large group of wargamers. I mean, each wargamer spends a ludicrous amount of money on the hobby. So Games Workshop doesn't need it to become, a mainstream thing. I don't think it really ever can become a massive mainstream hobby. And I do think that, I love Total War because that empire building, the idea of massive armies clashing over one another, that is, that's a look and a feel of the game that appeals to me. And it's very applicable to Warhammer. Probably the same types of things. The hobby, the painting, those are all different. But the actual gameplay could actually be fairly similar. And I do have some kind of superficial kind of evidence for this. But I worked at a map library. One of the student employees, he's another history student, so he and I kind of got along really well. We realized we had a lot of interests. Total War, the series came up. He was really into Empire Total War, and he played, Medieval and all these others. And, we got into Total War conversations quite a bit. A couple of weeks later, I said, just kind of jokingly, boy, we have a lot in common. You don't play Warhammer by any chance, do you? And he's like, yeah. And so he's just one of those guys that, they're the same type of what people want out of Total War can in some sense be applicable. And it's very rare, I find, to actually meet people that are involved in the hobby outside of a hobby context. That's only happened like a couple times in kind of my life. So to actually meet someone, his gateway or the things that we both had common was Total War, I think that's a very good sign. So I think probably the final biggest thing, and it's something I have already a little bit alluded to, is just brand recognition. Even if people don't necessarily play the wargaming side. The very fact that they know what Warhammer is, they know of it, is a good thing for the hobby. And I think that definitely things like Dawn of War and all the video games like that are just a good platform for awareness, if nothing else. So those are my thoughts on the topic of the week. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a good one.